Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, wherever you may be in the world. And let's get started today with the educational review of Tate's 2007 article regarding weight loss and physical activity. Let's get started here, shall we? Alright, so here's the paper. Long-term weight loss. This is a doozy. Long-term weight loss is associated with prescription of higher physical activity goals. Are higher levels of physical activity protective against weight regain? Well, let's find out. Alright, so here's the background we got here. So we know that weight is associated with certain health outcomes because of the association between weight, BMI, and hypertension, things of that nature. So keep in mind this article was around 2007, and before there was a point in time where recommendations for weight control was like expending basically 1,000 kilocalories per week, or roughly like 30 minutes of walking per day, right? And then in 2002, the Institute of Medicine upped this to 60, which puts it around like 2,100. 3 years later, this was also supported by the dietary guidelines. And this observation was also reported by the National Weight Control Registry, where the participants who were able to sustain long-term weight loss had higher degrees of physical activity. So what's the purpose? If we already know all this and it's been stated 3 times. Well, basically, the information in the article didn't indicate a time factor. So what this study does, it shows what those changes look like over a period of time. A short-term time frame between 12 to 18 months, and then a long-term frame of 30 months. And see how well increased physical activity increased weight loss and mitigated weight regain. So they used a randomized control study of 202 participants, where across 2 locations, I might add, there was a standard 1,000 calorie group and a 2,500 group. So there's an 18-month exercise intervention where they also worked on some dietary restrictions between 1,000 to 1,500 calories depending on base weight, where 20% of that intake was fat. There was a previous report already for the 18-month, so they didn't really focus on it as much. They were more concerned about the long term, so that's what's really we're going to look at here. Again, we had 202 participants at the start, 158 at the ending. 58% were female, 80% of the population was white. The study targets people who are between 14 and 32 kilograms overweight. Subjects were between 25 and 50 years of age and had no serious medical or psychological complications. All right, so they're overweight, but nothing seriously wrong with them. The primary measurable, obviously, is weight. Height was measured by a statiometer. Physical activity was measured by a self-report questionnaire for the previous week, not the current week, the previous week. And dietary intake was estimated with a questionnaire that was then plugged into a software that estimates caloric intake. We used general linear modeling for repeated measurements, taking the same measurements over and over again, which could have been more explicitly defined, but that's at the end. And participants that were missing data were assumed baseline. So basically, they took time assessments at baseline, 6-month, 12-month, 18-month, 30-month. If you were unable to get data at one of those points, then your values were assumed baseline. So what did we find? The effective time, like how much time was spent doing activity, or how much time in a linear sense of programming, right? So throughout the 6 months was very effective as opposed to 3 weeks, is basically what that means. However, there was not really a statistically significant observation between the treatment and time. So just doing something for a long time was more effective than how hard they went. Here we can see the results, and basically just to summarize this, we had similar dietary intake. You can see by when we look at protein at baseline is very similar, at the post is very similar. Not a very large degree of change, right? But interestingly enough, the baseline activity and the post-treatment activity were the same as well. So they went through the intervention and kind of went back to their normal habits afterward. So this really confounded the data in a sense, because we weren't able to get a true sense of, okay, what does physical activity look like and how does it have this preventive effect. But luckily, there were 13 participants that demonstrated high adherence to the recommendation guidelines. And more importantly, they were still active after the treatment. So you can kind of see here that these 13 individuals, mostly the same, right? So we have similar energy intakes between groups, both prior and during. Protein input is similar. Fat intake is reduced, actually. And carbohydrate load very similar. But the energy expenditure is the biggest part here. So they didn't really change much, but they stayed active. And so we had the subgroup was used as to really derive correct interpretations, since a majority of the group that should have been in a high PA returned to baseline. So the long-term analysis was basically ineffective. And basically you found what you expected. The highly active group experienced a greater degree of weight loss. Here they are. This triangle group just kind of shoots on down, stays really low, and eventually gets some of it back, right? And so, but the degree of weight regained is decreased. So what do we find? Well, the major findings are basically that consistent elevated physical activity increases weight loss, right? The amount of time is what's important, not necessarily the degree of activity itself. But weight loss has to be more of a lifestyle choice, and not, hey, I did this thing, I'm good now, right? So there's a lot of limitations for the use of self-report. I mean, you get recall bias, obviously, things like that. One of the biggest ones that irked me was the not measuring of compositional changes. Basically, we know that for an average population, BMI is probably a good indicator of health. But if you don't factor body composition into that, you're really only getting an incomplete picture, right? So when they say that we have an individual who's 32 kilograms overweight, well, that's probably, it's overweight, but what does that composition look like? Is this somebody who's a bodybuilder? Or are we assuming that this is a normal populace, right? Like, those confounding variables kind of weren't explained or elucidated anywhere. And just the fact that we had so few people actually adhering to the treatment. Is 13 people really representative of the effects on an entire populace? I'm going to lean towards no. I mean, it can give you some insight, but it's not enough to be a breakthrough. So, what did we learn? You gotta be like this guy who was supposed to move. In conclusion, basically, just do more movement and you're gonna get more weight loss. It's funny how you expend energy and then you lose weight. Crazy concept. Weight regain is not preventable. That totally makes sense. When you think about the mechanisms of exercise, what are you doing? You're increasing your aerobic metabolism, generally if you're doing moderate activity. So you're increasing your ability to do lipid metabolism. You reduce fat stores. You're going to also increase lean muscle mass, which weighs more than fat mass. So, yeah, at some point you should expect the physiological adaptations to produce more work in response, which typically comes with muscle mass. So, yes, I would expect that you would regain some degree of weight. And again, activity must be maintained and incorporated into a lifestyle. You can't just like, I did this thing for a few months and then I'm good for the rest of my life. That's not how the body works. We are a constantly adapting machine. So, oh man, what is my critique of this? I was fairly unimpressed with this article overall. Basically, the thesis question of, again, measuring weight loss and not body composition is, it puts the wrong thing into perspective and focus. The sample size that's applicable is severely low, with only 13 people. Also, they choose only overweight individuals and not kind of experiencing the effect overall holistically in a populace. Is the goal, then the thesis statement should have been more refined to the effect for weight loss for overweight individuals, as opposed to leaving it so open-ended. Because I think it'd be interesting to contrast, like, hey, what do these models look like for people who are overweight, and what do these models look like for people who are, quote, normal, right? I think the design itself is fine. A randomized control study that where part of the group is much more active than the other group. I think that's fine. I think the measurements could have been more objective based. I'm not 100% sure what the cost of accelerometers and heart monitors would have been in 2007, but I can't imagine it been that expensive, especially when you consider that in the study design they use monetary incentives and social cognitive theory, like bringing friends together so that way it's a group activity for the higher PA group. And they utilize nutritionists, psychologists, and exercise physiologists to develop these workout regimens. So, reallocating some of those resources to get a more objective measurement tool, it seems like it would have probably been the way to go. They did address, actually, the lack of adherence and say that probably a thing to do in the future, if you were to run this again, is either run it for longer so that way you develop the habits more effectively as opposed to just forget them, or have some type of contact after the 18th month treatment period. So basically what happened was they did the treatment for 18 months and then they didn't contact any of the participants at all for another 12 months after that. So there wasn't really a mechanism to invigorate the need for exercise and physical activity. So yes, because of this, we had to extrapolate conclusions from a very small subset. And yeah, that basically just mars the entire results. So to me, this article does not present any new significant findings. Rather, it just kind of reinforces the things we already know and understand, right? It's like, yeah, weight loss is it's a lifestyle choice. You gotta do it. You gotta have high output, low intake, right? So, what new information did we garner? Like, okay, well, maybe you could argue that we learned that 6 months of increased physical activity was where the greatest degree of weight loss was experienced. And after that, you got to gain more weight. But that weight could just be a compensation of muscle mass due to biological adaptation mechanisms. So, that is my spiel. I hope you guys found this interesting and informative. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below. Until next time, stay classy.